Story 1, The Hill of Laments. At the top of an isolated and forgotten hill stands a small village in ruins, which for decades has been avoided by the inhabitants of nearby towns. People refer to it as the Hill of Laments, a name that alone strikes fear into even the bravest souls. They say that at night, when the wind blows, the laments of lost souls can be heard echoing between the ruins of the houses and the ancient battlefield that once existed there. People tell stories about the destruction that occurred there during World War II. The village was the scene of a horrible massacre, where soldiers, believing that the local residents were hiding enemies, slaughtered men, women, and children. Their unjust and violent deaths condemned their souls to wander the hill, seeking revenge, consolation, or perhaps just someone to hear them. Felipe, a journalist specializing in paranormal investigations, had always been skeptical about such stories. He believed that behind every scary legend, there was a logical explanation that could be uncovered with a good investigation. When he heard about the Hill of Laments, he immediately saw an opportunity to expose the truth behind the legend and attract a good audience to his blog. He arrived in town in the late afternoon and began interviewing the few inhabitants who were willing to talk about the hill. An old man named Severino, who had lived there his entire life, was the only one who accepted without fear, but his tone was extremely serious. "You're looking for trouble, young man? Those who go up to the hill never return the same. I've seen people come back with empty eyes, like life had been ripped out of them. And others, well, others never came back," Severino said as he lit a cigarette and stared at the horizon with tired eyes. Although skeptical, Felipe noticed that Severino wasn't the only one avoiding talking about the hill. Whenever he mentioned the place, the townspeople would avert their gaze, whispering among themselves. Curious, he decided that that very night he would climb the hill. He was determined to document everything, the sounds, the sensations, and any paranormal activity he could capture. At dusk, Felipe began walking up the dirt path that led to the top of the hill. The gentle breeze between the trees soon turned into a cold, cutting wind, enough to make anyone reconsider their decision to continue. But Felipe pressed on, armed with a flashlight, a camera, and an audio recorder. When he finally reached the top of the hill, the silence was oppressive. There were no sounds of animals, nor the rustling of trees, only the sound of the wind. He began exploring the village ruins, with houses destroyed by time, nature slowly reclaiming what had once been civilization. His recorder was running the entire time, capturing the unsettling silence. But then something changed. The first sound came as a distant whisper, quiet enough for Felipe to wonder if he had imagined it. He stopped and turned up the volume on the recorder. Again the whisper, this time clearer but still indecipherable. He looked around, lighting up the ruined houses with his flashlight, but saw nothing but shadows. Carefully walking, he entered one of the more preserved houses. The smell of mold and decay was strong, and the wooden floor creaked beneath his feet. Shining his flashlight inside the house, Felipe noticed an old mirror, covered in dust, hanging on the opposite wall. Something about that mirror made him pause for a moment. There was something different about it. As he approached, the wind seemed to stop for a moment, and the house plunged into deadly silence. He looked into the mirror and saw something. It wasn't his reflection. The face staring back at him was that of a man, with distorted features and an expression of pure despair. Suddenly, the man in the mirror started screaming, but there was no sound. It was as if the scream was trapped in space, visible but completely silent. Felipe recoiled, frightened, and the mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces, scattering shards of glass across the floor. Outside, the laments truly began. No longer were they soft whispers but distant screams, echoing in the darkness. Overcome with a fear he had never felt before, Felipe ran out of the house. But as he stepped outside, he realized something terrible. The fog that had been far off in the distance now surrounded him completely, obscuring his vision and making it impossible to see the way back. The cold intensified with each passing second, seeping into his bones, and the laments were everywhere. Panicked, Felipe ran aimlessly, trying to find an exit. But the dense fog seemed like a maze, and the screams drew closer, as if the souls of the dead were closing in on him. Shadows moved at the edges of his vision, and he knew he was no longer alone. As he ran in desperation, he tripped over something hard and fell to the muddy ground. Looking back, he saw that he had stumbled over a wooden cross, covered in moss. It was one of many crosses scattered across the hill, marking the mass graves where the massacre's victims were buried. Suddenly he felt a presence. Something cold and inhuman was behind him. Trembling, he slowly turned around and saw a tall, shadowy figure with hollow eyes and a face twisted by suffering. The figure reached out toward him, and Felipe felt his body freeze in place. He tried to scream, but his voice wouldn't come out. The figure drew closer, and Felipe knew in that moment that the stories were true. The hill was alive with the pain and suffering of those who had died there, and now he was next. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was the figure's face transforming into that of a child, her eyes filled with tears and an expression of pure terror. And then everything went dark. When the sun rose, the townspeople found only Felipe's camera at the top of the hill, surrounded by the fog that never seemed to disappear. The recorder was still running, and the audio captured Felipe's last moments, the laments, the screams, and finally the sound of something being dragged across the ground. Felipe was never found, and the Hill of Laments remains a place where time and death are tangled in an eternal cycle of pain and suffering. Story 2: The Scarecrow of the Valley. In an isolated valley, surrounded by tall mountains and dense forests, there was a small farming village that quietly thrived. The harvests were abundant, the fields fertile, and the weather generally favorable. However, the village carried a dark secret, passed down from generation to generation: the scarecrow that watched over the fields. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary scarecrow made of straw, dressed in old, patched clothes, with a faded hat covering its head. But its origin and purpose were far more terrifying than any outsider could imagine. Decades ago, when the village was still in its early days, the valley was ravaged by a terrible plague. The crops withered, the animals fell ill, and the villagers, desperate, watched their children die of hunger. It was during this time that a strange man appeared in the village. He was a traveler, dressed in dark clothes and a heavy cloak. No one knew where he came from, but he offered a solution to the plague: to build a special scarecrow, a protector for the fields. In exchange, he asked for only one thing: the villagers were to follow his instructions to the letter, without ever questioning him. Desperate, the villagers agreed. The man gave them detailed instructions on how to build the scarecrow. It had to be made of straw, but with bones buried beneath it, and its face should not be carved by human hands. He promised that as long as the scarecrow stood, the village would prosper. Reluctantly, the villagers followed his instructions. When the scarecrow was raised, the crops miraculously began to grow again and the plague ceased. The village recovered, but at a price few fully understood. The stranger disappeared shortly after the scarecrow was completed, but the villagers knew his presence still lingered, watching over them. The elders of the village said the scarecrow demanded a silent tribute. They didn't know exactly what it was, but with each harvest, something dark seemed to happen. Animals disappeared, children fell ill without explanation, and sometimes, a villager would simply vanish in the middle of the night. Joaquin was a young farmer who inherited his parents' property, along with the responsibility of maintaining the scarecrow. For years, he had followed the traditions without question, but over time, his curiosity grew. He didn't understand why the scarecrow was so important to the village or why no one ever moved or replaced it. Unlike his older neighbors, Joaquin didn't believe in superstitions and eventually decided that the scarecrow was nothing more than a useless object. One day, in the middle of the harvest, Joaquin decided to remove the scarecrow from the field. His neighbors warned him not to do so, begging him to respect the old traditions, but he was determined. He thought it was ridiculous that the entire village feared a straw doll. That very day, he walked to the field and, without ceremony, pulled the scarecrow from the ground. The moment he pulled the scarecrow from the post, something strange happened. The sky, once sunny, suddenly turned dark, covered with heavy clouds. A cold wind swept through the valley, and Joaquin felt a shiver run down his spine. He looked at the scarecrow in his hands and realized something was wrong. The straw that made up the Scarecrow's body seemed to pulse as if it were alive. The fabric face began to deform, and Joachim, horrified, saw something moving beneath the tattered clothes. Terrified, he dropped the Scarecrow to the ground and ran back to his house, feeling the wind howling in his ears. Once inside, he locked all the doors and windows, hoping the terror would pass. But that night, something far worse happened. While Joachim tried to sleep, he heard heavy footsteps outside his house, as if something was walking through the field. He looked out the window and under the pale moonlight, saw a tall, thin figure standing in the middle of the field. It was the Scarecrow, but now it was no longer hanging on the post. It stood tall and erect, staring directly at Joachim's house. The young farmer tried to convince himself it was his imagination, but the footsteps continued, growing closer. He locked himself in his room, but soon the footsteps began echoing inside the house. They were slow, dragging, as if something large and monstrous was moving, climbing the stairs. Joachim felt panic wash over him. He hid under the bed, trembling, as he heard the floorboards creak under the weight of something heavy and terrifying. The door to his room slowly opened, and he felt the cold air flood in. The Scarecrow was there. Its presence filled the room with an oppressive darkness. Joachim didn't dare look, but he felt the weight of the Scarecrow's gaze on him. The sound of straw scraping against the floor surrounded him. He knew he was about to be taken. The next morning, the villagers found Joachim's house empty. The front door was open, and the Scarecrow, which he had removed, was standing in the field once again, more imposing than ever. The straw in its body was now stained with blood, and its eyes, made of worn-out black buttons, seemed to gleam with a malevolent light. The villagers knew the Scarecrow had claimed its tribute. Since then, no one has dared to touch it again. They say that at night, if you walk through the field, you can see the Scarecrow move, its arms stretching out as if waiting for the next person who dares to disrespect its authority. It continues to watch over the crops, protecting them, but demanding a terrible price in return. Story 3: The House with Closed Windows. In a small, remote town, at the end of a street forgotten by everyone, there was a house that no one dared to visit. The house had a peculiar appearance. All its windows were closed, day and night, covered by thick, time-worn blinds. The doors were always locked, and there was never any movement inside. However, the townspeople swore that at night, they could see faint lights flickering through the cracks in the windows. Some said the house was cursed. Others simply refused to talk about it. Decades ago, the house belonged to a lonely woman named Clara. Little was known about her life, but everyone in town knew one thing. Clara had a daughter, a girl who was never seen outside the house. The rumors began when Clara started buying large amounts of food, yet no one ever saw or heard the daughter. Some people thought the girl was sick or deformed, while others believed Clara was just overly protective. But the truth was far more sinister. Clara kept her daughter, Isabella, locked in one of the upstairs rooms of the house. The girl had been born with a strange deformity. Her eyes were too large for her face, and her skin was a ghostly, grayish tone. Afraid of being judged by the town, Clara decided that her daughter would never see the outside world. For years, Isabella lived trapped in her room, with only the dim light of candles to illuminate her days. Clara fed her through a small slot in the door and never allowed the girl to leave. The years passed and Clara grew old. One day, without warning, she died. When the neighbors noticed that she hadn't been seen for weeks, they decided to enter the house to check on her. The door was unlocked and the smell of death hung in the air. They found Clara's body lying on the living room floor, but there was no sign of Isabella. Climbing to the upper floor, the neighbors broke down the door to the locked room. What they found there was beyond any nightmare. The room was filled with scratch marks on the walls, as if someone had desperately tried to escape. There was a small bed, now covered in dust, and grotesque children's drawings covering every surface, drawings of figures with large eyes and distorted mouths. But there was no sign of the girl. After Clara's funeral, the house was sealed. For years, it remained unoccupied, and no one dared to go near it, especially at night. Over time, the house fell into disrepair, and the legends about the girl locked in the room began to spread. Some said that Isabella was still there, wandering the halls, while others believed that her spirit was trapped, haunting the place. Letitia, a young woman who had recently moved to town, didn't believe the stories. When she heard about the house, she was intrigued and decided to visit it. She was a paranormal investigator and saw the house as an opportunity to create an interesting report. Despite the warnings from the locals, Letitia prepared herself and, one night, entered the house. The interior was covered in dust and cobwebs. The floor creaked beneath her feet, and the air was thick and musty. Letitia turned on her flashlight and began to explore. At first, everything seemed normal, though eerily abandoned. But when she reached the upper floor, things started to change. As soon as Letitia entered the hallway leading to Isabella's room, she heard a faint whisper. She stopped, feeling a chill run up her spine. The whisper grew louder, as if someone was speaking behind the door. She slowly approached and with trembling hands pushed the door open. The room was exactly as the neighbors had described it, filled with scratch marks, disturbing drawings, and an oppressive atmosphere. However, something else was there. In the center of the room was a small rocking chair that had not been mentioned in the reports. And to Letitia's horror, the chair began to rock on its own. She backed away, but before she could leave the room, she saw something reflected in the mirror on the opposite wall. A small figure with large hollow eyes stood beside the bed. The figure didn't move, only stared. Letitia screamed and ran out of the room, but the hallway now seemed longer, as if the house was distorting itself around her. The whispers turned into childish laughter, and Letitia felt something following her, always just out of sight. When she finally reached the front door, she found it locked. Desperate, she tried to force it open, but the laughter continued and the rocking chair creaked in the distance. The last thing Letitia saw before passing out was the reflection of a girl in the mirror, smiling at her. The next morning, Letitia was found by the police, collapsed on the house's porch, incoherent and in shock. She never spoke about what she saw that night, and the house with the closed windows remains empty, but at night, the townspeople swear they can still hear the laughter of a child coming from inside. Story 4: The Forest of Whispers. Long ago, deep in the heart of an isolated mountain range, there exists a forest that no one dares to cross. Known to the locals as the Forest of Whispers, it is surrounded by legends of people who entered and were never seen again. The few who return speak of mysterious voices that whisper in the wind, calling them toward the center of the forest. The tall, ancient trees seem to hold secrets from a forgotten time, and the ground is covered with such dense vegetation that sunlight barely manages to penetrate. The forest, they say, is a place where the boundaries between the world of the living and the dead have worn thin. Those who enter there do not face only the wildness of nature, but also the weight of the souls trapped between the two worlds. Lucas was a tour guide specializing in extreme trails, and when he heard the stories about the Forest of Whispers, he was fascinated. He believed the whispers were nothing more than wind passing between the trees, a simple acoustic illusion, and he decided to organize an expedition. He took 3 of his friends with him, all experienced hikers and adventurers. As soon as they entered the forest, the atmosphere changed. The sound of dry leaves crunching beneath their feet and the occasional chirping of birds disappeared, giving way to an eerie silence. The air felt heavier, almost tangible, and the sunlight, which had been strong at the beginning of the trail, was being swallowed by the thick vegetation. As night fell, the sense of discomfort became even more pronounced. They set up camp in a small clearing, and that's when the whispers began. At first, they sounded distant, as if they were just the wind. But soon, Lucas realized they were forming words. He approached his friends, but they remained silent, as if unaware of the sounds. The whispers, however, became clearer to him. Lucas, come. The voices were soft, almost sweet, and seemed to come from all directions at once. He ignored the voices, thinking it was just his imagination. But that night, he had a disturbing dream. In the dream, he was walking through the forest, following a shadowy figure. The figure called his name, leading him to an ancient, twisted tree at the center of the forest. When he finally reached the tree, he saw human faces emerging from the trunk, mouths open in silent screams, as if they were trapped within the wood. Lucas woke up in a cold sweat but didn't tell anyone about the dream. The next morning, one of his friends, João, was missing. His tent was empty and his belongings were intact. They searched for hours, calling for him, but there was no sign of João. With each step they took, the whispers grew louder and more insistent. "You shouldn't be here. Leave. Lucas, why did you come back?" The group began to panic. No compass worked correctly, and the tracks they followed seemed to disappear, as if the ground itself was erasing them. Later that afternoon, another friend, Pedro, disappeared without a trace. Lucas and Mariana, the last remaining friend, decided it was time to give up and leave the forest, but the path back seemed to have vanished. The trees closed in around them as if the forest were alive, shifting its form. Night fell again, and the whispers were now loud and relentless. Lucas and Mariana heard their own voices calling out to them, but they refused to follow. Desperately, they tried to find a way out. But then, in the dead of night, they heard João scream. Following the sound, they found themselves in a clearing. In the center stood a twisted tree, the same tree from Lucas's nightmare. Trapped within the trunk of the tree were the faces of João and Pedro, twisted in pain. Mariana screamed, but before they could react, the tree's roots began to move, wrapping around their legs, pulling them into the ground. Lucas tried to fight, but was swallowed by the earth, the voices whispering in his ears, "Now you belong to the forest." The next morning, the rescue team found the campsite abandoned. The tents were torn, and there were signs of a struggle, but no bodies were found. The forest, as always, remained silent. They say that if you venture too deep into the forest of whispers, you can still hear the voices of Lucas, João, and Pedro calling for help, but no one ever comes out. Story 5. The Doll Factory. On the outskirts of an abandoned industrial town, there stood an old doll factory that, decades ago, produced toys for children all over the country. But the factory was abruptly shut down after a series of disturbing events. It is said that the dolls made there were never just ordinary toys. They carried something evil, something that made them more than mere inanimate objects. Letitia, a curious photographer, heard about the factory while searching for interesting locations for her new project. Fascinated by the idea of capturing the mystery and abandonment of the place, she convinced two friends, Carlos and Ana, to go with her. Upon arrival, the building was immense and imposing, its windows dirty and broken, and the facade weathered by time. The factory was surrounded by a rusted wire fence, and the silence around it was total, as if even the wind was afraid to approach. They entered through a half-open side door. Inside, everything was covered in dust, and the old doll production machines stood like the skeletons of a once thriving industry, now abandoned to decay. As they walked through the dark corridors, Letitia began photographing the place, trying to capture its oppressive atmosphere. Soon, they reached an assembly room, where hundreds of unfinished dolls were scattered. Some were only partially assembled, others lacked eyes or were headless. Carlos, light-hearted, joked as he picked up one of the dolls, but he quickly dropped it, startled. "It's warm," he muttered. Letitia and Ana laughed, but when they touched another doll, they felt the same thing. The dolls were warm as if they had just been made. Something was wrong. The trio continued to explore, but as time passed, they began hearing noises. Small, quick footsteps, as if something were running through the corridors. Occasionally, they heard faint giggles, but when they looked around, there was nothing to be seen. The factory seemed to be coming to life. In one of the deepest rooms of the factory, Letitia found an old office filled with shelves of fully assembled dolls, all in perfect condition. Their features were so lifelike, it was hard not to feel as if they were being watched. While photographing the room, she noticed something strange in the pictures. In some of them, the dolls seemed to be moving. At the moment the camera clicked, Letitia swore the dolls' heads had turned slightly, or that their glass eyes had blinked, but her friends insisted it was just her imagination. However, as they ventured further into the factory, they found more evidence that something was happening. Their flashlight beams flickered inexplicably, and the sound of footsteps grew louder. Then it happened. Carlos, who was leading the way, stopped suddenly, staring at the ground. There, in the middle of the corridor, stood a doll. He swore it hadn't been there before. They tried to retreat, but when they turned around, the door through which they had entered was locked. The dolls around them seemed to have moved closer, their expressions frozen in strange smiles. Panic gripped the group, and Letitia began shouting for them to leave. They ran through the corridors, but the factory felt like a maze. The sounds of giggles grew louder, and suddenly the dolls began to move. Small but relentless, they crawled across the floor, their porcelain hands stretching toward the group. Carlos tripped and fell, quickly surrounded by the dolls. They moved with frightening speed, and before Anna and Letitia could do anything, Carlos was dragged into the darkness. The two women ran, but the doors continued to lock as they passed, as if the factory were alive, determined to trap them. Anna was the next to be caught, her hands grabbed by dolls that emerged from the shelves. She screamed, but her scream was quickly silenced. Letitia, now alone and desperate, found her way back to the office. There, in the middle of the room, stood the main doll, with her glass eyes staring coldly at her. Letitia knew there was no escape. The dolls, now silent, encircled the office, and Letitia felt her legs go numb. Looking one last time at her camera, she saw something that chilled her to the bone. In every photo she had taken, her images were blurred, but the dolls were perfectly clear, as if they were the only living things in the factory. The factory remains abandoned, but those who venture near swear that at night, they can hear faint giggles and the soft click of a camera snapping pictures in the dark. Story 6. The Woman in the Mirror. When Alice moved into her new apartment, she never expected that a simple mirror could turn her life into a nightmare. The mirror, left behind by the previous tenant, was large, with an ornate golden frame that seemed out of place amidst the modern decor of the apartment. Alice didn't think much of it until strange things began to happen. In the first week, Alice started to feel the unnerving sensation that she was not alone. At first, it seemed like paranoia, an odd shadow caught in the corner of her eye, a strange reflection in the mirror. But things soon escalated. At night, Alice began to hear faint whispers, low and indistinct, whenever she passed near the mirror. She told herself it was just the stress of moving, but deep down she knew something was wrong. One night, while brushing her teeth, Alice noticed something truly disturbing. In the reflection of the mirror, standing behind her, was a woman. The woman's face was pale, with hollow eyes and dark, sunken circles. She wore a long, dirty dress, and her hair was disheveled. Startled, Alice turned around quickly, but the bathroom was empty. When she looked back at the mirror, the woman was gone. The phenomenon continued. Each time, the woman in the mirror appeared closer, her empty eyes fixed on Alice as if studying her. The feeling of being watched through the mirror became unbearable. Alice tried covering the mirror with a sheet, but every morning the sheet was mysteriously on the floor, as if someone or something had removed it during the night. Determined to find out what was happening, Alice began to investigate the history of the mirror and the previous tenant of the apartment. She discovered that the woman who had lived there before, an artist named Clara, had mysteriously disappeared years earlier. No body was ever found, and the only item left in the apartment was the mirror. Alice began having unsettling dreams, in which she found herself trapped inside the mirror, banging desperately on the glass, trying to escape while her own reflection continued living her life in the real world. She woke up each night drenched in sweat, with a gnawing feeling that something terrible was about to happen. On the final night, Alice could no longer avoid the mirror. She knew the woman was waiting for her. When she approached the mirror, she felt a shift in the air, as if the environment itself was changing around her. The woman's reflection appeared again, but this time she was smiling. Before Alice could move away, the woman in the mirror reached out and in one swift motion, grabbed Alice's arm, pulling her into the mirror. Inside the dark, distorted world of the mirror, Alice saw reflections of other people who had been trapped before her. Their hands beat against the glass trying to escape, but it was useless. Alice now was just another reflection, while the figure of the woman took her place in the real world, living Alice's life as though she were her. Story 7. Room number 6. In an old, faded, and decaying hotel, there was one room that no one wanted to stay in. Room number 6 was avoided by all guests, and the staff never spoke about it. Its doors were always closed, its windows locked, and for years no one dared to sleep there. But the truth was that once that room had housed something terrible, something that could not easily be forgotten. The hotel was a relic from a bygone era, and despite its old appearance, it still attracted curious tourists drawn to its legends. One night, a traveler named Davi arrived at the hotel and, unaware of the room's reputation, asked for the first available room. The receptionist, with tired eyes, tried to dissuade him, but the hotel was fully booked. Davi, indifferent to superstitions, accepted room number 6. Upon entering, the room seemed ordinary though old-fashioned. The decor was outdated, and the only object that stood out was a full-length mirror leaning against the wall, its surface stained with time. Davi unpacked his bags and got ready for bed, ignoring the slight discomfort he felt in the air. On the first night, everything was silent, until Davi started hearing whispers, so faint they could easily be mistaken for the wind. He got up, looked out the window, but saw nothing. He went back to bed, but the whispers continued, this time louder, as if someone were standing next to his bed. "Help me," was what he heard repeatedly. Now fully awake, Davi turned on the lights and looked around, but the room was empty. The whispers stopped for a moment, but as soon as he went back to bed, an intense cold filled the room. The mirror began to emit a low, creaking sound, and Davi noticed something strange. In the reflection, the room looked different, darker, with deep shadows that seemed to move at the edges of the image. He approached the mirror, trying to understand what he was seeing, and then he saw her. A woman stood behind him in the mirror, though the room itself was clearly empty. Her skin was pale, and her eyes were hollow and lifeless. Her face was twisted in terror, and her lips moved, murmuring something Davi couldn't hear. When he turned around quickly to look, there was no one there. The mirror, however, continued to show the figure of the woman, now moving closer to his reflection. He tried to leave the room, but the door wouldn't open, as if it were locked from the outside. The air grew denser and the lights began to flicker. The whispers, once faint, turned into desperate screams. Davi backed away to the bed, feeling trapped, as the figure of the woman in the mirror drew closer and closer. She finally came so close to his reflection that Davi felt as though he could touch her. "Leave this place, before it's too late," she whispered in a trembling voice. Suddenly, an invisible force pushed him back, and the mirror cracked in the middle. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the room, and the figure of the woman vanished, leaving only Davi's pale, terrified reflection. The next day, Davi woke up in bed with no clear memory of what had happened after the mirror broke. He gathered his things and left the hotel as quickly as he could, without speaking to anyone. But as he left, he heard something that made him stop for a moment. A faint whisper from far away, coming from room number 6, calling him back. Davi never returned to the hotel, but later discovered that the woman he had seen in the mirror was a guest who had mysteriously disappeared in room number 6 years before. And the mirror, now broken, never reflected anyone again, except those who dared to spend a night there. Story 8. The Train with No Destination. On the outskirts of a small town, there was an abandoned train station, where rusted tracks cut through the land like scars from a forgotten era. The local residents told stories of a ghost train that passed through the station at midnight, always empty, except for a sinister presence occupying its cars. Legend had it that if you boarded the train, you would never return. Ricardo, a young adventurer, heard the stories during his stay in the town, and like many skeptics before him, he didn't believe them. He decided to spend the night at the station to see the train for himself, ignoring the locals' warnings. Equipped with a camera and flashlight, Ricardo arrived at the station just before midnight. The place was in ruins, with moss growing between the tracks, and the wind whistled through the broken windows. The silence was absolute, except for the distant call of an owl. Ricardo settled on the waiting bench at the station, a mix of excitement and disbelief brewing inside him. Then, at the exact moment the clock struck midnight, he heard it. A low, long whistle that pierced the stillness of the night. To his surprise, a train appeared, seemingly emerging from nowhere, rolling along the rusted tracks, its cars shining under the full moon. The locomotive was old, with a design that looked to be over a century old. Ricardo, still curious and skeptical, stood up and walked toward the platform. The train's doors opened automatically, revealing a dimly lit interior, apparently empty. Against his better judgment, he stepped inside. As he crossed the threshold, a cold shiver ran down his spine. The interior of the train was vintage, with red velvet seats and lace curtains. The air inside the car was heavy, as though it had been still for decades. Ricardo looked around, expecting to see signs of life, but the train was eerily quiet. He walked through the corridors, listening to the echo of his footsteps, until he finally found a figure, a man sitting alone at the end of the car, dressed in a black suit. The man didn't lift his eyes to meet Ricardo's, and his face was obscured by the shadow of his hat. Ricardo tried to speak to him, but got no response. As he moved closer, he noticed something strange. The man didn't seem to be breathing, nor was he moving. Panic began to well up inside Ricardo, and he backed away, but then something even more terrifying happened. The train began to move. The sound of the tracks grew louder, and Ricardo tried to exit the car, but the doors were locked. Looking out the window, he realized they weren't passing through any familiar landscape. There was only darkness outside, an oppressive void. His panic increased as he realized the train was traveling to a place that didn't exist. As the train sped up, Ricardo began hearing voices. Murmurs, followed by sinister laughter that echoed through the cars. He ran from one car to the next, but the corridors stretched endlessly with no end in sight. The windows revealed nothing but darkness, and the train seemed to be outside of time and space. Finally, Ricardo reached the last car, where he found something even more disturbing. The walls were covered in carved names, the names of people who had disappeared, according to the legends, after boarding that same train. At the end of the list, he saw his own name perfectly etched into the wood. The moment he touched his name, the train stopped abruptly and the doors opened. Desperate, Ricardo ran out, finding himself back at the platform of the abandoned station. He looked around, gasping for breath, but the train had vanished. He was alone, enveloped in the silence of the night. Ricardo never fully understood what had happened that night. He returned to the town, but something had changed. The people no longer recognized him, and when he looked in the mirror, his reflection seemed different, almost as if it were slowly fading. He now knew the truth behind the ghost train. It didn't just take people, it erased their existence. Story 10, The House of Stopped Clocks. At the end of a deserted street, there was a peculiar house that all the residents avoided. It was a large, imposing house, but strangely neglected, as though time had stopped there. It wasn't just its appearance that caught people's attention. All the clocks inside the house were stopped, frozen at different times. They said that time inside the house had been altered by something sinister, something that the previous residents could never explain. Lucia was a paranormal investigator fascinated by unusual stories. When she heard about the House of Stopped Clocks, she knew she had to explore it. Ignoring the locals' warnings about disappearances and mysterious sounds from within, Lucia entered the house alone, confident that she could demystify the place. The first thing she noticed upon entering was the silence. There were no sounds from outside, as if the house blocked out the world beyond. Everything seemed incredibly old, from the dusty furniture to the walls covered in portraits of people Lucia didn't recognize. And in every corner there was a clock, wooden wall pocket clocks, all frozen at different times. Lucia began to explore the house carefully, noting every detail in her journal. She realized that each clock showed a different time, but the second hand on all of them was stuck in the same spot, as if they had all stopped at the exact same second regardless of the time shown. As she walked through the dark corridors, she began to hear something. At first it sounded like a distant echo, but soon it became clearer. It was the sound of ticking clocks, but not coming from any of the stopped clocks in the house. The sound seemed to come from somewhere deeper, from the heart of the house. She followed the sound, descending a narrow staircase that led to the basement. The air there was cold and heavy, and the feeling of unease intensified with each step. At the bottom of the basement, Lucia found a single clock still working, large and imposing, with complex gears that turned slowly. The ticking was deafening in the closed space. But the most disturbing thing was the reflection the clock's glass projected. It wasn't just reflecting the room, it showed people's faces, all with expressions of terror frozen in time, their bodies distorted by the gears. As Lucia approached, she realized the faces were not just in the glass. They were inside the gears, as though they had become part of the clock's mechanism, trapped forever in its endless cycle. Suddenly the clock stopped. The silence in the basement was complete. Lucia tried to move, but something was wrong. Her own movements seemed to slow down, and she realized with horror that time around her was changing. The ticking sound started again, but now it came from inside her head. Her hands began to move involuntarily, as though they were part of the clock. The house, slowly, was imprisoning her in time. Lucia never left the house. The clock in the basement started ticking again, and her name was added to the list of those whose souls had been captured by the mechanism. Since then, the house of stopped clocks remains avoided, its ticking still echoing at night, waiting to claim its next victim who dares enter. If you've made it this far, don't forget to leave a like to support the channel, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay up to date with all the new content. See you in the next story.